Welcome back on to international news. Mass burials will be held in Sierra Leone today for victims of a mudslide that swamped dozens of homes on the outskirts of the capital, Freetown. Nearly 400 people are known to have died. At least 600 people are still missing. Foreign governments began mobilizing aid, with Israel pledging to provide clean water, medicines, blankets and other essentials. The UN said it was evaluating the humanitarian needs in the country and that contingency plans are being put in place to mitigate any potential outbreak of waterborne diseases such as cholera, typhoid and diarrhea. The Red Cross said it was struggling to excavate families buried deep in the mud that engulfed their homes, and that the city's military hospital, several children were treated with multiple injuries, including a 6-month-old baby. Many children also lost their parents. For more on the Sierra Leone disaster, we are now joined via Skype by Matthew Cochrane of the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. He has been part of the task force handling issues around the tragedy there. He is at the IFRC headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us. Now, how many people are confirmed dead? There's reports that it's just over 400. What numbers have been confirmed, and with regards to injuries as well?
Yeah, there seem to be a couple of numbers floating around. I've heard 300, more than 300. I've heard over 400. Whatever the figure is, it's going to climb. There's at least 600 people who are still missing. And as every hour goes past, it's less and less likely. Although we remain hopeful, but it's less and less likely that survivors will be found. So this becomes really a recovery operation. About 100 people have been injured, and those people have been ferried to hospitals in Freetown or provided first aid on site by Red Cross volunteers.
Now, Matthew, which are the most affected areas in Sierra Leone currently?
Yeah, it's around Freetown, so it's communities around Freetown, around Racecourse, which is just on the eastern side of the city, and then further south, I think the community is called Sugarloaf. I think I might have got that wrong actually, but it's under a hillside that was totally denuded and it sort of washed through. There's been flooding and landslides across the city, but there are 3 main sites where it's been particularly devastating and deadly.
And how many people have been displaced so far? Do you have any figures with regards to that? And do we know how many lives were lost in an instance?
Yeah, it's in terms of those numbers, I think they're probably a little bit clearer than the death toll at this stage. I understand about 1,600 families have been affected. Some of those have lost their homes entirely. Some of those have had their homes damaged. Maybe some of those are in areas that are not considered safe. So they'll have quite significant short-term, medium and even longer-term shelter needs. As I said, in terms of the number of people killed, it's at least 400, but that number will continue to climb in the coming days as more people are found.
Now, Matthew, let's speak about the issue of possibilities of more mudslides. Are those expected? Yeah. Is there some way of knowing and ensuring that there's contingency measures in place with regards to if it happens again within this short space of time?
Yeah, so it's raining. It's been raining on and off since the tragedy. And there are fears, I think, of further mudslides. I don't know specifically. I don't know if there's any specific hillsides that authorities are worried about. I mean, obviously, the contingency planning needs to take place ideally well in advance. Identifying where the hotspots are, where the dangerous areas are, and then trying to mitigate those risks, or even potentially evacuating people in advance. I'm sure everyone's on heightened alert across Freetown and across the country. It's not a necessarily unusual amount of rain, but it's a combination of rain, of environmental damage, of poverty, of poor urban planning, and all these factors come together and are just being catastrophic. And you read reports, you hear reports, you talk to colleagues, and the city is in shock. And this is a city that's gone through a lot, but just is in total shock over what's happened this week.
Now, Matthew, was this expected?
No. I'm a long way away. I'm in Geneva. No, I don't think it was. But a lot of the factors that I mentioned before, the environmental degradation, the heavy rain, the poor urban planning, the highly vulnerable communities living right under these hillsides that were denuded, that didn't have any vegetation to bind them together. These were factors that were known. So I don't know if they were known in hindsight, if they were known in the past, but in hindsight, perhaps they could have been anticipated, and they're certainly known now. And I think one of the outcomes of this crisis has to be better urban planning, better safety for vulnerable communities. You know, there's a truism in the humanitarian world that it's always the poorest people that suffer the most, because they're the ones that have the fewest protections. They're the ones where the urban planning is the weakest, where the social infrastructure isn't in place. It's true in South Africa. It's true in every country in the world. It's certainly true in Sierra Leone.
Now, we've seen Israel has come out and given their assistance and are giving their assistance. Sierra Leone has come out and requested for international assistance and aid. Is this coming? Is this forthcoming? Is the international community responding? And, you know, what's the turnaround time in terms of that?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, from an International Red Cross side, we released yesterday about 270,000 Swiss francs. It's about $300,000 US dollars to fund this initial phase of the response, search and rescue and first aid, those kind of elements or those kind of actions. I had a meeting this afternoon with colleagues, and I think we'll be formalising a request for international funds from governments around the world. You mentioned Israel has been forthcoming. I know Italy has as well, and a few others. We need to obviously be sure that we know exactly what the needs are and what the role of the international community is going to be in supporting the recovery. But the government, I think, has been quite transparent and quite candid about its needs and has welcomed international assistance. So that's a really good foundation for a collaborative and effective response.
Matthew, what are the main challenges that the rescue efforts are facing currently?
Well, I mean, access is very difficult. I spoke to some of your producers today who were trying to desperately get through to colleagues on the ground in Freetown and were unable to get through, and that's a challenge that we've been facing today, just basic infrastructure, telecommunication infrastructure. I spoke to a colleague who's running our operation on the ground in Freetown earlier this week, and he said his internet's been down, was even down before the landslide, because it had been raining non-stop for 3 days, so there's a very fragile telecommunications infrastructure. And then on the ground, roads have been impacted, water and sanitation infrastructure has been destroyed or cut off. It's hard to get to the areas where these disasters have happened. It's hard once you're there to get through the mud. It's a very difficult emergency response operation.
And what, in terms of the affected areas, what, if anything, has government been able to say with regards to these areas going forward? As you mentioned that it's difficult areas to get into or to access, and we've also learned that some of these affected areas are at sea level. What is government going to do, or have they been able to respond with regards to what their plans are going forward?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm the best person to answer that. I mean, I think there's a recognition that what has happened can never happen again, and there are natural steps that will be taken as a consequence of that. Better urban planning, better community-level disaster risk reduction and disaster preparedness, helping communities to be more informed and more active and supported to mitigate the risks they face. In terms of the concrete actions, I think it's a really good question, but I think it's probably a little bit too early to know. But I mean, we always say it, disasters, even amidst a tragedy, there's an opportunity to rebuild in a way that doesn't allow them to happen again, to build back better, to build back smarter and safer. That's a mantra within the Red Cross, and it's certainly a message that we'll be taking in our partnership with government and authorities moving forward.
Matthew, thank you so much for joining us. We'll have to leave it there for now. That was Matthew Cochrane of the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, and he was joining us via Skype from Geneva.